Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of those times in history that'll make you thankful for modern law and order. Because the medieval world didn't mess around when it came to punishments. Picture this: you're in a tiny, muddy village. Maybe you've stolen a loaf of bread or given someone a sharp retort. Seems harmless enough, right? Well, in the harsh laws of the medieval period, such minor transgressions could land you in some of the most horrifying predicaments you can imagine. And no, it's not the plot of a dystopian novel. This was reality. You probably won't survive this, unless you were very lucky or had enough gold to bribe your way out. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, feel free to drop your location and what time it is where you're tuning in from. I love seeing how far this journey takes us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We start with medieval justice, and let me tell you, the laws back then were brutal. Picture a world where an insult could cost you your hand or a theft might get you a one-way ticket to the gallows. Justice in medieval times wasn't about fairness or rehabilitation. It was about keeping order and, sometimes, making an example out of people. Imagine committing a crime as minor as picking a pocket or insulting a noble. Your punishment would be swift and merciless. You see, the medieval system was based on a strict set of rules that didn't leave much room for grace. Any offense, no matter how small, could end in a penalty that seemed to surpass the crime itself. This is the age where someone could face death or torture for stealing something worth less than a couple of coins. But the reasons behind such severe penalties weren't always just a thirst for power. Back then, society had to maintain strict control in a world filled with wars, famines, and plagues. Stability was fragile, and so the law came down with heavy fists. Imagine standing in a crowded town square, watching a public hanging for something as minor as stealing a loaf of bread. Sounds surreal, doesn't it? Yet, for medieval townsfolk, these public punishments weren't just warnings for would-be criminals. They were a part of daily life. Public executions and brutal punishments were spectacles, not only designed to punish, but to serve as a harsh reminder of the consequences for breaking the law. Historians still argue whether these methods were actually effective in deterring crime, or whether they simply fueled fear and resentment among the common people. What we do know is that they were certainly unforgettable. People weren't simply jailed. They were humiliated, tortured, and sometimes even executed in ways designed to shock and terrify. So, as we walk through tonight's story, remember, there was no second chance in medieval justice. No appeals, no parole, just a swift and often horrific fate for those who broke the law. Now that you have the picture of how the medieval law could easily turn someone's day from bad to life-ending, let's take a closer look at the daily life of the people who lived under this harsh regime. For most folks, life wasn't just tough, it was brutal. Medieval peasants lived in constant fear of making even the smallest mistake. One wrong word or action could spell disaster. You're working in the fields all day, barely able to feed your family. And yet, you still had to be constantly aware of the law's ever-watchful eye. If you're caught with stolen goods, even if you didn't mean any harm, you could end up facing a punishment that feels more like a death sentence than a warning. In the medieval era, social class played a big role in how justice was meted out. Peasants were the ones who suffered the most under the law's heavy hand, but they weren't the only ones in danger. A small crime from anyone, whether a peasant or a noble, could set the stage for dramatic consequences. But while nobility might escape with a fine or a mild reprimand, peasants were often subject to the worst of the punishments. Imagine, for example, that you're a peasant caught committing a minor crime. maybe something like an insult or disobedience to a higher ranking person. The penalty? You could face something as severe as flogging, public shaming, or worse, torture, all in front of a watching crowd. The fear of breaking the law was constant. In a world without the modern conveniences of courts, lawyers, or even a reliable system of governance, your fate was often sealed on the spot. And that didn't just mean physical punishment, it could mean losing everything. In fact, peasants were sometimes forced to pay fines so exorbitant that they lost their land or homes. These kinds of punishments didn't just strip you of your wealth, they stripped you of your very future. You worked hard your whole life, only to have it all vanish in the blink of an eye. The punishments weren't always just about control. They were often about maintaining fear and power over the entire population. Imagine being part of a group where the idea of making a mistake could cost you everything, from your wealth to your life. People knew that life could go from mundane to catastrophic in an instant. A bad decision could lead to a permanent mark on your body or soul. Historians still debate whether the severity of these punishments was a deliberate effort to maintain control over the lower classes, or whether it was simply a consequence of the times. With rampant illiteracy, a lack of proper communication, and frequent warfare, the threat of extreme punishments may have been seen as necessary to maintain some semblance of order. So, if you were a peasant back then, you'd know that a misstep could mean everything you worked for. Your family, your land, your life was at risk. Let's think about the kind of crimes that could land you in the middle of these terrifying punishments. The medieval world was built on a strict code of conduct, and any breach of it, no matter how trivial, could result in catastrophic consequences. A simple theft? That could cost you a hand or more. An insult, even a mild one, could lead to public humiliation or worse. The line between life and death or freedom and a lifetime of suffering was razor thin in those days. For many, it wasn't about the crime itself, but rather the way it disrupted the delicate order of medieval society. In a time when the church and monarchy held immense power, crimes were seen not just as law-breaking, but as a threat to the divine right of rulers and the very fabric of society. So even if you were a poor, starving peasant who stole a loaf of bread to feed your family, the punishment didn't always take into account the context of your actions. It was about enforcing the laws above all else. Take a simple theft, for example. Picture this. You're starving and you decide to steal a loaf of bread from a merchant. It's not the kind of crime that screams danger to society, right? It's a simple act of desperation. But in medieval times, stealing was seen as a direct affront to the owner's property, and an act that could set off a dangerous chain of events. Your punishment? A public execution or brutal torture. Maybe they'd cut off your hand or even hang you in front of the entire town as a warning to others. In these instances, you weren't being punished for the value of what you took, but for violating the law and the status quo. Interestingly enough, medieval law didn't always care about intent. It didn't matter whether you were stealing to feed your starving children or because you were a hardened criminal. The law was absolute, and its power was in making examples out of people. Historians still argue whether this strict interpretation of the law was actually a means of keeping control during times of instability, or if it was simply a reflection of an era that viewed harsh punishment as a way to demonstrate power. Either way, the consequences were the same. A single slip-up could lead to permanent and often brutal repercussions. If you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or if you just happened to upset the wrong person, punishment could feel more like a death sentence than a fair penalty. Even something as simple as a public insult could lead to brutal consequences. Insulting a noble, for example, wasn't just a matter of hurt feelings. It was an affront to their status and power. And in a world where class divisions were so rigid, disrespecting those at the top could result in everything from whipping to forced exile, or worse. You could be publicly shamed, branded with a mark, or forced to perform labor for your supposed wrong. The stakes were high, and the punishments were designed to match. This isn't even getting into the kinds of punishments reserved for serious crimes like heresy or witchcraft, where the penalty might be death. When the laws of the medieval world came down on you, they didn't care whether you were guilty of a minor infraction or a major crime. The punishment was the punishment, and there was little room for mercy. Some people, however, did survive these dark times. Those who were lucky enough to have powerful friends or connections, say a local noble or a church official, might be able to escape the most extreme penalties. But for most, justice was a cold, merciless thing. Life was fragile, and even the smallest mistake could send you into a spiral of suffering that was hard to escape. The system didn't care about your context or whether you had a family to care for. It just wanted to make sure the law was respected and feared. Now that we've covered the frightening reality of everyday medieval crime, it's time to meet one of the most feared and often misunderstood figures in this dark world, the executioner. If you think about it, the role of the executioner in medieval society was one of both dread and fascination. These men, and sometimes women, though rarer, were responsible for carrying out the death sentences and often other forms of public punishment that were common in those days. They weren't just killers. They were the law's hand of justice, delivering the final blow for crimes that were deemed unforgivable. And no, it wasn't a job that came with a lot of glamour or gratitude. The executioner's job was complex, and the emotional weight wasn't easy to carry. These were individuals who had to see the most brutal aspects of society every day, from beheadings to hangings. And in many cases, they were looked upon with both fear and respect by the townspeople. But they didn't just wield the axe or rope, they were also tasked with ensuring that punishments were carried out in full public view. There was a certain grim theatricality to their work, as the public would gather to watch the criminal face their punishment. This wasn't just about sending a message to the criminal, but to the entire community. Imagine the eerie silence before the executioner's blade dropped. It wasn't just about the condemned. It was about making sure that everyone watching understood the consequences of breaking the law. It's important to realize that executioners weren't always the villains they're often painted as. Many of them were just men forced into a gruesome profession, which was sometimes handed down through family generations. While their work was horrific, their personal lives were often isolated and full of stigma. Townspeople often avoided contact with them, believing that merely coming near an executioner could bring bad luck or even the wrath of God. In fact, many executioners were considered to be social outcasts, and they lived on the fringes of society. They often had little choice in the matter. There weren't many other career options available to someone born into the trade. What's fascinating is that the executioner's role didn't just involve death sentences. Often, executioners would be called upon to carry out other forms of punishment, such as mutilation. Imagine this. A thief caught for robbing a merchant could be beaten, branded with a hot iron, or have a hand chopped off as part of the penalty. For some crimes, such as slander, a criminal might even have their ears cut off to mark their offense. These acts were horrific, but they also had a practical function. It ensured that the criminal could never commit the same crime again without carrying the visible mark of their past on their body. Historians still argue whether executioners took any pleasure in their job or if they were merely doing it out of necessity or duty. Some records suggest that many executioners were deeply affected by their work, while others claim that some may have seen it as a form of power. relishing in the control they had over life and death. Either way, these individuals were often caught between their moral qualms and the need to survive in a brutal society. But one thing's for sure, they were the human face of a justice system that didn't shy away from showing just how severe the penalties could be. The executions themselves were not simply swift affairs. Some of the more elaborate punishments involved cruel devices designed to make the process slow and painful. Take the infamous breaking wheel, a form of execution where the condemned would be bound to a large wooden wheel and then either beaten to death or left to die slowly as they bled out. Some of these methods were so grotesque that they were meant to be a public warning, reinforcing the law's power in the most brutal way imaginable. And then there's the public spectacle. You can't talk about medieval executions without mentioning how they were often done in public, in full view of crowds, as a form of social control. The execution wasn't just a punishment, it was entertainment. In fact, it became a spectacle for the masses, something that everyone could witness and discuss. For those in the crowd, watching a criminal meet their fate was a form of morbid enjoyment, an opportunity to see the punishment that the law had decreed for an offense, no matter how minor. This wasn't just a punishment for the criminal, it was a reminder to everyone in the crowd about the price of breaking the law. It was a kind of dark, community-wide lesson in what happens when you defy the established order. Imagine yourself there in that crowd, nervous, maybe even a little fascinated. You know the criminal did something wrong, but there's still a part of you that wonders whether the punishment is too severe for the crime. That's how it was in medieval society, where the fear of punishment and the desire for order made the executioner a central figure in maintaining control. As we take a deeper dive into the world of medieval punishments, let's pause for a moment and think about the spectacle itself. Imagine this. The town square is packed with people, the smell of food stalls mixing with the crowd's anxious whispers. You've heard the rumors. The thief, the heretic, or the accused witch is about to face their punishment. Everyone gathers, eager to see what happens next. This wasn't just some behind-closed-doors affair. This was an event for the whole community. Public executions were designed to be as much of a performance as a punishment, drawing crowds from miles around. And trust me, they didn't skimp on the drama. Whether the condemned was sentenced to hang, beheading, or some other gruesome end, the entire process was carefully orchestrated. There was no sense of privacy here. The medieval justice system had one goal in mind: to ensure that the punishment was seen, heard, and felt. And in many cases, the punishment would take place in front of everyone. This was meant to be a very real reminder of the consequences of breaking the law. People watched, sometimes with a kind of grim curiosity, as the law's iron grip took hold of someone's life. The crowd's reaction was often just as important as the punishment itself. While some may have been eager to see the crime carried out, others might have been disturbed or even outraged at the harshness of the punishment. It was in these moments that medieval society's complex relationship with justice and entertainment blurred. In fact, executions could sometimes be a crowd pleaser, especially when the condemned had committed crimes like murder or treason. The crowd would cheer and jeer, creating a kind of macabre festival atmosphere, almost like a sporting event where the stakes were life or death. Historians still debate how much emotional detachment people in these crowds had. Were they hardened by the constant presence of violence, or were they just part of a ritual that had been ingrained into their lives for so long? There's evidence that some people came to see the punishments as just part of the social fabric of their town or village. It was a grim reminder of the power of the law, but it was also something they couldn't look away from, like a train wreck happening right in front of them. And don't forget, this was before television and the internet. This was real, raw entertainment. But not everyone saw these public executions as something to cheer. In fact, there were always murmurs of opposition from those who felt that some punishments were overly harsh. The tension in the crowd would sometimes rise when it was clear that the punishment didn't fit the crime. How could anyone deserve to be publicly drawn and quartered for stealing a loaf of bread after all? These debates may have gone unnoticed by the authorities, but they surely shaped the way people thought about law and order. In some places, the punishment could be delayed or even changed, depending on the public mood. If a convicted criminal's family was wealthy or influential enough, they might be able to sway the authorities into reducing the punishment or offering an alternative. However, the general consensus was that public humiliation was a big part of the punishment. This wasn't just about getting rid of criminals, it was about making sure the community saw the consequences of disobedience, ensuring that everyone else would think twice before acting out. In this context, even the most minor offenses had the potential for these extreme, very public consequences. Take the example of the stocks and the pillory. These were the ultimate tools of chash, public shaming. They didn't necessarily involve blood or death, but they were still brutal in their own way. Imagine being locked in the pillory, your head and hands secured so that everyone could throw tomatoes, rotten food, or worse at you. It was a humiliating form of punishment, and the public nature of it made sure that your shame was seen by everyone. Some were lucky enough to only face a few hours of it, but others were left there for days, exposed to the elements, with the constant mocking of the crowd weighing down on them. It wasn't just the physical discomfort, it was the psychological toll that came with being publicly disgraced. Historians still argue whether these forms of public punishment actually worked as effective deterrents. Did they actually reduce crime, or did they just fuel a culture of fear and shame? While it's clear that the public nature of the punishment served to remind everyone of the power of the law, it's hard to say how much it genuinely influenced behavior. Perhaps it was less about stopping crime and more about maintaining control and reminding people of the consequences of stepping out of line. In any case, these punishments weren't just a way to deal with crime, they were meant to reinforce a social order. They were a kind of public contract between the rulers and the ruled, a display of the power of the monarchy, the church, and the justice system. Violating the law was seen as violating the social contract itself, and the punishments, often gruesome and public, reflected just how seriously that was taken. In the end, justice wasn't always about fairness. Now that we've covered how medieval punishments were often carried out as public spectacles, let's delve into one of the darkest corners of medieval justice: torture. If you thought the public executions were bad, torture was on a whole other level, and it wasn't just reserved for the worst criminals. It was often a tool to extract confessions. Imagine a world where your guilt wasn't proven by evidence, but by the pain you could endure, or the confession you could give under duress. This was the grim reality for many who found themselves under suspicion of crimes in the medieval period. Torture wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was a legal practice. In many medieval societies, particularly in the early and high Middle Ages, torture was an accepted method of determining guilt or innocence. If someone was accused of a crime and there was little to no evidence, they might be subjected to trial by ordeal, a process where the accused would undergo physical torture, and if they survived, they were considered innocent, or if they died, it was assumed they were guilty. This idea of divine intervention was rooted in the belief that God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But let's be honest, this wasn't justice, it was a cruel form of luck. The methods of torture varied greatly, but they were all designed to break the spirit, extract a confession, or simply make someone admit to something they hadn't done. The rack, a device where the victim was stretched beyond their limits, was one of the most infamous tools used. The Iron Maiden, which, despite its mythological status as a medieval torture device, was often only used in the 18th century, is another example of the grotesque ways in which the law was enforced. Still, the principle of torture was alive and well during the medieval period, and it was used regularly by authorities to keep people in line. What's chilling is that torture wasn't always used on hardened criminals. It was frequently used on those accused of crimes like theft, witchcraft, heresy, or even simple defiance. If you were accused of being a witch, for example, the authorities would often use torture to get a confession. The fear of witches in medieval times was so intense that innocent people, usually women, were forced to confess to practicing witchcraft under extreme pain. These confessions were almost never valid, but that didn't matter. It wasn't about the truth, it was about the confession. It was a system that was built on fear, and it didn't care whether you were guilty or not. Historians still debate whether torture was an effective means of finding the truth. Some believe it was simply a mechanism to justify punishment by forcing people to admit to things they might never have done. Others argue that it was a far product of medieval beliefs in divine justice, a misguided attempt to extract the truth from someone who might be hiding their sins. Whatever the case, it's clear that the use of torture was a powerful tool for maintaining order, especially when the law lacked concrete evidence or witnesses. The physical and emotional scars left on the accused were often permanent, and the long-term consequences were just as severe as the physical pain they had endured. What's even darker is that torture didn't always result in death, though it certainly had the potential to. Many victims would survive, but their bodies would be left permanently maimed, and they would carry the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. This was justice medieval style, not about fairness or even truth, but about proving who had power over whom. And in the case of torture, the power dynamic was terrifyingly clear. The authorities controlled not only the body, but also the mind of the accused. Now, you may be wondering, what if someone didn't crack under the pressure of torture? It wasn't uncommon for victims to refuse to confess, no matter how much they were subjected to. But even in these cases, the authorities had a backup plan. If someone didn't confess after prolonged torture, they might be executed anyway, just as a precaution to maintain the law's authority. After all, who could challenge the system that controlled both life and death? We know that torture, as horrific as it was, didn't just end with the medieval period. Its legacy continued well into the modern era, especially in certain parts of the world where it was seen as a necessary evil for obtaining the truth. The medieval justice system set the stage for countless other atrocities carried out in the name of law and order. While the methods may have evolved, the idea of extracting confessions at all costs remained a dark thread running through history. Historians still argue whether torture was truly effective in medieval times, or whether it only deepened the divisions between the rulers and the ruled. But one thing is certain: torture was a terrifyingly integral part of the medieval justice system, and it served as a brutal reminder of just how far the authorities were willing to go to control their subjects. Let's take a moment to step back from the grim world of torture and death and talk about a form of punishment that was almost as infamous, yet not quite as lethal: public shaming. If you think the punishments we've discussed so far were rough, the pillory and as stocks were just as harsh, but they came with an added dose of humiliation. Instead of swinging a blade or burning someone alive, these methods involved locking the accused into an uncomfortable position for the public to mock, scorn, and sometimes physically abuse. It may sound like a scene from a comedy, if you're being generous, But in reality, the pillory and stocks were brutal methods of punishment designed to strip away not just your dignity but your sense of worth. Imagine yourself as a commoner in medieval times, caught for a minor crime. Perhaps you were guilty of something like drunkenness, gossiping, or insulting someone of higher status. Your punishment? The stocks where you would be publicly restrained, often for hours or even days, while the rest of society got to throw stones, rotten food, or insults at you. The whole point of the punishment was to humiliate you and make sure everyone knew that you'd been caught doing something wrong. And while the physical discomfort might have been bad enough, it was the mental and emotional toll that made the pillory such a punishing experience. To make matters worse, these public displays weren't just about physical restraint, they were also about shaming the accused in front of their community. This was not just a punishment for the crime, but a lifelong brand that marked the individual. You might think, okay, it's just a few hours of standing there, but in medieval society, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the social stigma that came from being seen in the stocks could last a lifetime. You were no longer just a person, you were the criminal who had been publicly shamed, and that could stick with you forever. Historians still debate how effective these kinds of punishments really were in curbing crime. Some believe they were an essential tool in keeping order. After all, the threat of public humiliation would certainly be a powerful deterrent. Others argue that these methods of punishment served more to enforce social hierarchies and make sure that the lower classes stayed in their place, reminding them of their subjugated position in society. The fact that these punishments were often applied to minor offenses suggests that they weren't necessarily about the severity of the crime, but about maintaining control over the population by keeping them in line. But here's the thing that might surprise you. The stocks and pillory weren't just for men. In fact, women were often punished this way for crimes like gossiping, defamation, or even for being too outspoken in society. The shame and humiliation were doubly hard for women because of the rigid gender norms of the time. To be placed in the stocks or pillory was not just a public humiliation, it was a visual reminder of your place in a society where women were expected to remain quiet and subservient. The social stigma that came from such public punishments was often enough to ruin a person's life. If you were a woman publicly humiliated in the stocks, you might find it difficult to find a husband, let alone secure a place in society again. For men, the damage to their reputation could be equally devastating, but there was an added level of physical danger. Being publicly mocked often led to physical retaliation, with the crowd hurling rotten food, stones, or worse at the criminal. The threat of injury was real, and it wasn't uncommon for a person in the stocks to be physically assaulted while helpless. While it wasn't the same as torture, the crowd had its own sense of justice, and their anger could quickly turn violent. And let's not forget about the mental toll these punishments took. It wasn't just about standing there and taking an abuse. It was about the constant psychological pressure of knowing that everyone around you was watching, judging, and condemning you. Imagine standing in front of a jeering crowd, unable to defend yourself, unable to move, while the world around you continues to turn as you're trapped in your punishment. It was a form of social execution, where the shame was more enduring than any physical injury. Historians are still divided on whether these public punishments were effective deterrents. On one hand, the very public nature of them likely deterred many from committing minor crimes, knowing the punishment would be both humiliating and painful. On the other hand, the rise of the early modern justice system saw the decline of public shaming methods, with critics of the practice arguing that it was inhumane and often went too far in its cruelty. While these punishments might have provided immediate social order, they did little to actually solve the underlying causes of crime or provide any opportunity for the rehabilitation of the accused. These humiliation-based punishments weren't just a relic of the distant past. In many ways, they reflect how societies have always grappled with the balance between law and social control. Even today, public shaming can still be found in some parts of the world, albeit in more modern forms like social media cancel culture. The pillory may be long gone, but the concept of making someone pay for their crime in the public eye still lingers in some places. Ultimately, the pillory and stocks were tools designed to not just punish, but to remind the populace of the power of the law and the consequences of stepping out of line. And as you can imagine, that reminder wasn't always subtle. Now, let's take a look at something that might have been even more lasting than public humiliation: the medieval practice of branding criminals. Imagine this. You've been caught for a crime, no matter how small, and the punishment is a permanent mark on your body, a mark that will follow you around for the rest of your life. This wasn't some slap on the wrist. This was a visual reminder to everyone that you were a fubbed criminal forever. Branding wasn't just about punishment, it was about leaving an indelible, permanent reminder that could never be erased, a mark that told everyone you were guilty, no matter what you did. The most common form of branding involved a hot iron seared into the skin of the criminal. If you were unlucky enough to be branded, it wasn't just about the pain of the procedure itself. It was the stigma that would follow you after the fact. Imagine walking through town after having your hand or forehead branded. Everywhere you went, everyone would know you were a criminal. And it wasn't something you could hide. Unlike a prison sentence, a brand was something that followed you, a more public mark of shame, visible to anyone who crossed your path. It was a punishment that didn't just take away your freedom, it took away your dignity, your identity, and your ability to ever blend back into society. Branding wasn't just for those who committed heinous crimes either. Small infractions could result in branding. Theft, adultery, or even just being caught in the act of lying could lead to a permanent mark that would follow you everywhere you went. There was no forgiveness for your crime in the eyes of society once that mark was there. It was your permanent scarlet letter, and it wasn't just a slapdash affair. The brands were often specific to the crime you committed. So a thief might be branded with an image of a hand, while someone who committed adultery might receive a mark associated with that crime. The reasons behind this practice were, as you might guess, rooted in the need to control and identify criminals. In a world where records were few and far between, a visible mark was a form of identification that could be recognized by anyone. The idea was that once you had a visible mark, you would never be able to escape the consequences of your actions. Your brand was your eternal punishment, one that would linger long after the physical pain had subsided. Historians still argue whether branding was an effective form of punishment or merely a reflection of medieval society's tendency to impose its will through fear and shame. Some argue that it was a necessary tool for controlling crime, as it ensured that criminals couldn't easily reintegrate into society. Others point out that it was an inhumane practice, one that denied criminals the chance to start over and rebuild their lives. It's easy to see how it could be both. On the one hand, it was a permanent record of a person's crime, ensuring that they could never escape the label of criminal. On the other, it was a barbaric and socially isolating punishment, one that left people with no chance to recover from their mistakes. It's also important to note that our branding wasn't limited to just the lower classes. While peasants were most often branded, nobles weren't exempt from such public humiliation. In fact, branding could even be a way to reinforce social hierarchies, marking the lower classes with permanent visual reminders of their criminality, while the upper classes might face only fines or brief imprisonments. What's even more disturbing is that branding didn't always happen immediately after the crime was committed. In some cases, criminals were branded after years in prison or after a second offense. This could make it feel like a sentence that followed you everywhere, a punishment that had no real end point, forcing you to carry a mark of your wrongdoings for the rest of your life, whether or not you had reformed. Interestingly, branding was so widely practiced that it even spread to other areas of life. If you were a runaway slave or a prisoner, you might also be branded to signify your status. But the practice wasn't limited to only criminals. It was a tool used by those in power to maintain order and control, to ensure that people didn't forget their place in society. Even though branding as a formal punishment started to die out by the late medieval period, the symbolic power of the mark persisted for centuries in various forms. In fact, if you think about it, this idea of branding resonates with some modern-day practices. While we no longer brand criminals with hot irons, we still have ways of marking people, whether through criminal records, social stigmas, or even the modern practice of social media shaming, which can feel just as permanent and humiliating. But as we look back on this medieval practice, it serves as a stark reminder of how far the legal system was willing to go to ensure that people didn't forget their place. Branding was more than just a physical punishment. It was an emotional and social sentence, one that lasted far longer than the act of committing the crime itself. And it serves as a reminder of just how deep the medieval obsession with control and order really ran. Now that we've seen how even the smallest crime could result in permanent physical and emotional punishment, let's take a look at another form of medieval justice that had deep, long-lasting consequences: fines and forfeitures. In some cases, medieval criminals weren't subjected to the extremes of torture or execution. Instead, they were faced with the destruction of their lives in a more financially devastating way. Picture this. You've been accused of a minor infraction, like failing to pay a toll, or maybe your land is considered improperly inherited, and the punishment isn't torture. It's simply the complete loss of everything you've worked for. And that wasn't just for peasants. Even those in positions of power weren't safe from this kind of financial retribution. The concept behind fines and forfeitures was rooted in the idea of restitution, a form of justice that wasn't focused on punishment, but rather on forcing criminals to make restitution to their victims or to society. For peasants, this could mean the confiscation of land, or even their homes and possessions, for something as small as a debt, a misstep in an agreement, or an unpaid fee. But for those at the top of the social ladder, fines were a way to make them pay for their wrongdoings without the brutal physical punishments that peasants suffered. Fines could be astronomical and were designed to strip individuals of their wealth, sometimes even their power. Imagine losing your entire livelihood over a dispute or mistake. That was the reality for many medieval people. The fines weren't just monetary. They often came with the forfeiture of property, land, and goods. A minor crime could result in a person being entirely stripped of everything they owned, with no way to recover. For the wealthy, this might not seem as bad. After all, they could always pay their way out of trouble. But for the poor, these fines were crippling. There were no modern bankruptcy laws, no easy routes to get back on your feet once your possessions were seized. And the system wasn't always fair. Sometimes, innocent people lost everything simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Take the example of someone accused of theft. In many cases, the punishment wasn't just the loss of a hand or death, it was the confiscation of their property. Imagine working your whole life to buy a small plot of land, and then one day you're accused of stealing something, and without the means to defend yourself or pay a fine, you lose everything. For those in power, this form of punishment could act as a key subtle form of social control. It wasn't about harsh physical punishment, but about ensuring that even the wealthiest still feared losing what they had. Historians still debate whether fines and forfeitures were really an effective form of justice. On one hand, they were less physically brutal than torture or execution, but they could have devastating financial consequences. In many cases, these punishments served as a form of social control that ensured the rich stayed rich and the poor stayed in their place. They created an economy based on fear, a world where those who could pay their way out of trouble were never truly at risk of losing everything. Meanwhile, the poorest people, who had nothing left to give, were forced to live in constant fear of losing whatever little they had. One thing is clear: the system wasn't always just. The wealthy and powerful were more likely to escape severe punishments, with fines often being the only consequence they faced, whereas the poor were forced to suffer consequences that often destroyed their lives completely. It's a stark reminder that medieval justice wasn't about equity. It was about maintaining the status quo. If you were poor, even the smallest infraction could lead to your financial ruin, while the wealthiest simply paid their way to freedom. And don't think that these methods were only a tool of the monarchy. The church played a huge role in these fines, especially when it came to things like tithes, land disputes, or accusations of heresy. The church wasn't just a religious institution, it was a massive political and financial power in medieval society. And with its wealth and influence, it didn't hesitate to use fines to control the population. If you were accused of heresy, for example, you could face severe financial penalties, which in turn could result in the forfeiture of property, lands, or other valuable assets. In a way, forfeitures were the ultimate punishment for crimes. They didn't just hurt the criminal in the moment, they often had far-reaching consequences that affected entire families for generations. Losing land or property meant not just the loss of a home, but the loss of the ability to feed your family, to work the land, to maintain your way of life. It was a form of justice that struck at the very heart of people's survival. So, whether it was a small fine that left you destitute or the loss of your home and land, fines and forfeitures were a reminder that even minor crimes could lead to life-altering consequences. In medieval times, the rich could sometimes buy their way out of trouble, but for those without wealth, these punishments were a constant reminder that the law was never on their side. As we've seen, medieval punishments weren't just physical, they often involved humiliation, financial ruin, and a lifetime of shame. But let's take a moment to consider one of the more physically painful punishments that still made an impact long after the crime was committed: whipping and flogging. These were forms of corporal punishment that, while not as fatal as execution, were brutal in their own right. Whipping was one of the most common methods used to discipline those who broke the law, and it wasn't just for serious crimes. A simple offense could result in being whipped in front of the entire town, an act that left permanent marks both on the body and the psyche. In a world where maintaining order high was everything, flogging served as a visible symbol of authority. The process was simple, but the impact was profound. A criminal, often tied to a post or held down, would be lashed with a whip or a rod until their back was raw and bleeding. The severity could range from a handful of lashes for a minor offense to dozens of lashes for something more serious. Each strike wasn't just a physical assault. It was a symbol of the power, of the law. It wasn't enough to just punish the criminal. It had to be done in front of everyone so that they could see what would happen if they didn't follow the rules. While whipping was common in both rural and urban settings, there was also a form of public flogging. Used in some regions, picture yourself as a condemned person, forced to stand in front of a crowd of jeering onlookers who throw insults, sarks, or even rotten food at you as you endure the pain of the lash. Your back, likely bleeding and swollen, becomes a permanent reminder of the crime. Unlike other punishments that could be completed quickly, flogging could last for Gaza a long time. A slow and excruciating process that kept the criminal in the public eye for a prolonged period, ensuring that everyone present got the point. Historians still argue whether flogging was an effective deterrent against crime or if it simply served to keep the population in line through fear. On one hand, the immediate suffering and public nature of the punishment might have been enough to deter a person from committing the same crime again. But on the other hand, these corporal punishments often didn't address the root causes of crime. In many cases, it wasn't the fear of flogging that kept people from breaking the law. It was the fear of losing their social standing, of facing further punishment. Whipping and flogging became as much about maintaining social control as they were about punishment. The psychological impact of flogging should not be underestimated. The fear of public shame and the physical pain of the lash created a powerful tool for law enforcement. Even for those who weren't whipped themselves, the by sight of others suffering in the stocks or under the lash was a constant reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Imagine witnessing the brutal punishment of someone in your town. It was hard to forget the impact of such public displays of power. This wasn't about a crime being forgiven or punished. This was about ensuring that the entire community stayed in line. Flogging wasn't just about the physical scars, it was also about the mental scars that followed. In many cases, the criminal had to live with the consequences of their actions long after the physical wounds had healed. The shame of being whipped or flogged could be as debilitating as the physical punishment itself. For women especially, the mental toll of being publicly whipped or flogged was even more profound. In medieval society, women were often judged based on their morality and reputation. To be whipped in front of a crowd wasn't just a physical humiliation, it was a stain on a woman's character that could ruin her chances for marriage, social standing, or even respectability. For men, flogging could have similarly debilitating consequences. Not only were they physically damaged, but the punishment stripped them of their masculinity. In a society that valued strength and honor, there was no dignity in being publicly whipped. It didn't matter how strong you were, how respected you were. The lash was a great equalizer, a punishment that ensured the strong were brought down to the level of the weak. And even after the physical pain had subsided, the memories of that public shaming could linger for years. The scars, both emotional and physical, were lasting. It's important to remember that the medieval justice system wasn't a fair and equal system. Some people, particularly those of higher social status, could pay their way out of corporal punishments like whipping, while others had no such option. The rich and powerful could often avoid this kind of punishment altogether, leaving the poor and marginalized to bear the brunt of the law. For many, whipping wasn't just a punishment for a crime, it was a reminder of their place in society, reinforcing the divide between the haves and have-nots. Historians often debate whether these forms of corporal punishment were truly effective in reducing crime, or if they were just another tool for the elite to keep their power. While it's hard to say whether whipping was effective in reducing crime, one thing is clear. It was one of the most visceral and enduring punishments in the medieval era. Whether it was a public spectacle meant to instill fear or a personal reminder of a criminal's place in society, the impact of the lash was profound and far-reaching. For those who suffered it, it was an experience that shaped their lives forever. As we venture deeper into the darker side of medieval punishment, we encounter another brutal form of retribution that was meant to punish the body and the soul: exile. Imagine this. You're found guilty of a crime, maybe treason, maybe witchcraft, or perhaps just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And instead of being tortured or executed, you're sentenced to banishment. Your home, your family, your life as you knew it, all are suddenly ripped away, and you're forced to wander alone, either to survive in the wilderness or to find refuge in a far-off land where you're considered an outsider. Exile might sound like a mercy compared to death or torture, but in the medieval world, it was a punishment that could feel just as horrific as anything else. Exile wasn't just about being told to leave the city limits. It often meant being stripped of your rights and forced into a life of uncertainty. No more friends, no more community ties, just a life of wandering, dependent on the kindness of strangers or forced to find work in a foreign land, often with no protection. The risk of starvation, robbery, or violence was a constant companion. Those who were sent into exile were often doomed to the lonely and dangerous existence, isolated from the very people who had once been their support system. In some cases, exile wasn't permanent, but the possibility of a return was often filled with heavy restrictions. And it wasn't uncommon for the exiled person to be forced to live in extreme poverty for the rest of their days. While we often think of exile as a punishment for serious criminals or political enemies, it wasn't limited to just that. Sometimes exile was used for relatively minor infractions. In some cases, the punishment for a verbal insult or disagreement with someone of higher status could result in exile. It wasn't uncommon for exiled individuals to have their wealth confiscated, their land taken away, and all of their assets seized by the crown or church. This wasn't just a punishment for the criminal act, it was a complete erasure of identity, stripping a person of everything they had worked for, including their sense of belonging. Exile could be especially dangerous for those who had no family to support them. With no safety net, these individuals were often left to fend for themselves in foreign lands where they were viewed with suspicion. Imagine being forced to leave your home, never to return, wandering into unknown territories where language and culture were different, and you had no way of knowing whether you would survive. Even if you managed to avoid death or starvation, there was the constant fear of being captured and brought back to face worse punishment. Historians often debate how much exile was actually used during medieval times and how much it was just a mere threat. Some records show that exile was a favored punishment for those in political power, especially when the crime was seen as threatening to the ruler's authority, or when the criminal had some status to be maintained. Political exile was common, especially for those seen as rivals to a ruling monarch or church official. The idea was that exile removed the threat while still allowing the individual to survive. However, for the common folk, exile was often a mere death sentence in disguise. It meant living a life of constant fear, being marked as an outsider in a world where being part of a community was everything. In medieval society, being cast out from the community was often more damaging than the physical punishment itself. For the poor, the very concept of being sent into exile was a social death sentence. The medieval world was based on communities, on our bonds between families, villages, and towns. Being exiled meant that you had no way of supporting yourself, no way of protecting yourself. There were no safety nets, no modern institutions to catch you when you fell. The only option was to rely on the kindness of strangers. and that was a fickle thing at best. Interestingly, exile didn't just involve being sent away. In some cases, it also meant being forced to live in a special area or exile colony, where you were kept under strict supervision. For example, certain towns or monasteries served as places of banishment, where exiles would be confined for a period of time. However, even this was often seen as a second-class existence, living in a state of constant surveillance, removed from your old life, and unable to engage in any meaningful way with society. These exile colonies were often harsh, and the people who lived in them were just as likely to die from one disease or lack of food as they were to be punished further for attempting to leave. What makes exile particularly disturbing is that it wasn't just about being alone in the world. It was about being disconnected from any community support, any familial or social network that could help you survive. The psychological toll of being cast out from society was devastating. For many, exile was a punishment that felt more torturous than death itself. It left them in a constant state of survival, never knowing where their next meal might come from, where they would sleep at night, or whether they would be caught and brought back to face harsher consequences. Historians argue whether exile was truly effective in dissuading criminal activity, or whether it was merely another form of social control and institutionalized banishment that ensured those who challenged authority would never be able to return. What is certain, however, is that exile was one of the most isolating and punishing methods of medieval justice, and for many, it was a fate worse than death. We've explored how severe punishments were meted out for crimes as minor as a verbal insult or petty theft. But there was another form of punishment that was uniquely terrifying: witch hunts and heresy trials. In the medieval period, the fear of witches and the idea of heretical beliefs were rampant, especially in the wake of plagues, wars, and the constant uncertainty of life. People were desperate for explanations, and the church was more than willing to provide answers, however terrifying they might be. If you found yourself accused of witchcraft or heresy, the consequences could be devastating, and the method of punishment would often include torture, execution, or both. Being accused of witchcraft was one of the most feared accusations in medieval society, especially because the criteria for what constituted witchcraft were incredibly vague. A person could be accused of witchcraft for almost anything: a simple bad luck streak, someone's child falling ill, or being a woman with too much knowledge about herbal remedies. In many cases, accusations were rooted in superstition, fear, or as personal vendettas. If you were disliked, you were at risk. But once the accusation was made, it often led to a dark spiral that could result in torture or death. The trials themselves were deeply rooted in a belief that God and the Church were the ultimate arbiters of truth. If someone was accused of being a witch or practicing heresy, this guilt was assumed, and the only way to prove their innocence was to endure terrible pain or death. Torture was often used to extract confessions, regardless of whether the person was guilty or not. Imagine being tied to a chair, your limbs twisted in excruciating positions, or subjected to water torture, all in the name of extracting the truth from you. The medieval legal system often relied on these methods to force confessions out of the accused, many of whom were simply innocent victims caught in a wave of hysteria. Once a confession was obtained, whether through pain or sheer fear, it was often taken as gospel truth, and the accused were sentenced to death. The method of execution was just as horrific. Burning at the stake was a particularly common fate for those accused of witchcraft, as it was seen as a way to purify the soul while punishing the body. But even worse, the fear of being accused of witchcraft meant that anyone in the community could be targeted. It didn't matter if you were a quiet, kind person or if you had no history of wrongdoing. If someone had it out for you, A simple accusation of witchcraft could lead to your end. Heretic trials were not much different, with the only real difference being that the person accused was believed to be in violation of church doctrine rather than the natural world. If you were accused of heresy, you were seen as a threat to the very foundation of society, and the church would act quickly to punish you. The methods of execution for heretics were equally brutal: burning, beheading, or even being drawn and quartered were not out of the question. There was no leniency for those who spoke against the church or strayed from the accepted beliefs of the time. Being branded as a heretic was a death sentence, as it meant that your very soul was considered to be lost, and your physical death was merely a step in erasing your influence. Historians still argue about whether the medieval witch hunts were actually an effective way to prevent heresy or witchcraft, or if they were simply a way to consolidate power. The church and monarchs often used the threat of accusation and execution to instill fear in the general populace and ensure that their authority remained unchallenged. But in the end, it was clear that these trials weren't about justice. They were about control. In many cases, the people accused were completely innocent, often targeted because they were seen as different, strange, or unusual in some way. The psychological terror of knowing that anyone could accuse you of witchcraft or heresy was enough to keep most people in line. Even if you weren't directly accused, the constant threat of accusation meant that many people lived in fear, questioning their every action, worried that one wrong word or one strange event could be enough to send them to trial. Society became a place where fear and superstition ruled, and people were often more concerned about being accused than they were about any actual wrongdoing. In the end, the witch hunts and heresy trials left an enduring legacy of fear, where truth was irrelevant and power was enforced through terror. It didn't matter if you were guilty or innocent. If the church or the community decided you were a heretic or a witch, the consequences were often swift and deadly. As brutal as the other punishments we've discussed, witch hunts and heresy trials were fueled by an almost blind adherence to superstition, and they left behind a legacy of suffering and terror for generations to come. Historians still argue about the true extent of the witch hunts and the actual number of people executed for witchcraft or heresy. Some estimates put the number at tens of thousands, while others argue that it was much lower. Regardless of the exact numbers, the impact of these trials on medieval society was immense. It showed just how vulnerable the innocent were to the whims of those in power, and how quickly fear could lead to life-ending consequences. While many medieval punishments were rooted in superstition, social control, and a desire to instill fear, there was an even darker aspect to justice: punishments specifically directed at women. In medieval times, women were often considered subservient to men, and their punishment was often tailored to reinforce their place in society. Whether it was for the crime of witchcraft, adultery, or simply defying social norms, women bore the brunt of some of the most unjust and inhumane punishments the era had to offer. Often, women were punished not just for their actions, but for their gender, with punishments designed to humiliate, control, and break their spirits. One of the most famous examples of this kind of gendered punishment was the witch hunts, which we've already touched on. But women weren't just accused of witchcraft in times of hysteria. They were often targeted for offenses that men were allowed to get away with. Adultery was a particularly common crime for women. The act of being unfaithful to a husband, or sometimes even the mere suspicion of it, could lead to brutal punishments. In many medieval societies, women found guilty of adultery were publicly flogged or subjected to other physical tortures. In some extreme cases, they were stoned to death or forced to undergo humiliation in front of the entire town. often marked with branded white letters that showed they had committed a grave moral transgression. Another punishment specific to women was the ducking stool, an archaic device often used to punish women accused of scolding or being unruly. Women who were seen as disruptive or rebellious, especially those who spoke their minds, could be subjected to being dunked into cold water as a punishment for their perceived behavior. This wasn't just a mild penalty either. The procedure was meant to drown the woman into submission, as the punishment was painful, humiliating, and often dangerous. But it didn't just end with the physical act. Women were often subjected to long-term shame and social isolation as a result of being labeled as difficult or immoral. An even more damaging punishment in an era where social status and reputation were everything. The crimes for which women could be punished were often vague, but the consequences were clear. Women had fewer protections under the law than men, and often their very bodies were treated as property. The rape of a woman was sometimes punished with a fine paid to the family, not as a crime against the woman herself, but as a crime against her father or husband. The idea that women could be high punished for their own actions was almost unfathomable. Women were often seen as vessels for family honor, and if their actions somehow embarrassed that honor, they were fair game for the harshest forms of punishment. What's perhaps most disturbing about these gendered punishments was how they often reflected the fear and control that society had over women's autonomy. The idea that a woman's moral failings could be so destructive to the fabric of society was not just about the crime, it was about reinforcing patriarchal power. Many of the punishments, particularly those that involved public humiliation or physical torment, were designed not only to punish but to break a woman's spirit, forcing her to return to her proper place in society as a submissive wife, daughter, or servant. Historians still argue whether the harsh treatment of women in medieval justice systems was a sign of societal instability or a reflection of a deeply ingrained patriarchal belief system that sought to suppress and control women. Some point to the way women were treated as property and punished for defying gender roles, as evidence of a culture that feared female autonomy. Others argue that these punishments were more about reinforcing the control that men had over both their families and the broader social order. But what is undeniable is that these gendered punishments were often incredibly destructive to women's lives. In an age when reputation was everything, any kind of public punishment could ruin a woman's chances at marriage, employment, or any kind of social respect. The most tragic part was that many of these women were punished not because they had committed egregious crimes, but because they had been seen as difficult or unruly by a society that demanded conformity. Being out of place could be as deadly as committing any crime. These punishments were meant to enforce the belief that a woman's role was to remain submissive and to abide by the rules set by men. In this environment, it wasn't just about punishing actions, it was about breaking the force, spirit, and will of any woman who defied the gender norms of her time. The idea that punishment could correct women was a deeply ingrained cultural belief, and it often manifested in the most brutal and dehumanizing ways. Today, we can look back and see how horrific these practices were, but in the medieval world, they were seen as necessary for maintaining social order, the punishment of women. In these times wasn't just a matter of justice, it was a matter of control, of ensuring that women knew their place and didn't disrupt the hierarchical structure of society. And in this twisted system of punishment, many innocent women were destroyed, not for committing crimes, but for simply daring to step outside the rigid boundaries that society had placed on them. As we reach the tail end of our journey through medieval punishments, it's important to reflect on how these brutal methods left a lasting legacy. Medieval justice was merciless, but the harsh punishments of the time didn't just serve to punish those who broke the law. They shaped development of our modern justice system, even if some of the methods were left behind. The transition from public executions and torturous penalties to more humane forms of punishment was gradual, but the medieval system laid the groundwork for how we think about crime, punishment, and fairness today. One of the most significant legacies of medieval justice is the idea of deterrence. The medieval system relied heavily on tusks, making examples of criminals in a way that would instill fear in the general population. Executions were carried out in public places, often accompanied by brutal displays of suffering as a clear message. This is what happens when you break the law. These public spectacles weren't just about punishing the guilty. They were about making sure the community stayed in line. And while the methods were horrific, the intention was clear: make crime unthinkable. Not through rehabilitation, but through terror. The idea that severe punishment would prevent future offenses endured far beyond the medieval period, influencing criminal justice systems into the modern era. The gradual shift from public execution to incarceration marked a key transition from physical, often deadly punishments to a more controlled environment. By the early modern period, prisons began to replace gallows and public flogging as the primary means of dealing with criminals. This shift reflected a change in attitude. Punishment was starting to focus more on reformation and isolation than on public display or physical suffering. But even as this transition took place, the medieval legacy of using fear as a tool of control remained firmly entrenched in many cultures. What's also interesting is the way medieval punishments, particularly those like exile and branding, emphasized the importance of social order. Punishments often went beyond punishing the body. They were designed to break the individual's connection to their community. Exile, for example, was meant to strip away a person's sense of belonging, forcing them to wander without support, often leading to their ultimate demise. Branding left a permanent mark on the criminal's body, ensuring they would never be able to escape their past, never able to rejoin society without being labeled as a tsar criminal. These punishments weren't just about crime and punishment. They were about reinforcing the social structure, reminding people of their place, and ensuring that no one ever stepped out of line. Corporal punishment, like flogging and branding, also left a lasting mark. In many ways, it became the foundation for later methods of criminal justice, including the use of confinement and physical restraint. In prisons, whipping, which was one of the most common forms of corporal punishment in the medieval world, didn't just serve as a tool for punishment. It was designed to strip people of their dignity and break their spirits. This legacy continued into the 18th and 19th centuries, where flogging was still common in some military and colonial settings long after the medieval period ended. But perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the brutal punishments of medieval times is the capacity for cruelty that exists in systems of power. The sheer scale of punishment in the medieval world reflects a deep distrust of the common people and the ways in which law enforcement and justice were used as a means of maintaining power. Public shaming, torture, and execution weren't just about punishment, they were about ensuring that the rulers had absolute control over the lives of the people. It's a stark reminder of how societies can use law and order to instill fear and must maintain dominance, even when the methods are extreme and cruel. Historians still argue over how effective these punishments were in preventing crime. On one hand, they certainly created a climate of fear and obedience. On the other hand, these methods were deeply flawed, often punishing the innocent and not addressing the root causes of crime, such as poverty, inequality, and lack of education. The medieval system didn't believe in rehabilitation. It believed in breaking the will of the criminal, in ensuring that the punishment dwarfed the crime itself. As we look at the modern justice system, we can see how far we've come from the medieval system, and yet echoes of those ancient practices still linger in our laws and attitudes. The cues of incarceration, as a punishment, can trace its roots back to medieval ideas of punishment by isolation, and the ongoing debates around the death penalty echo the age-old question of whether the state has the right to take life as a means of justice. In some places, corporal punishment still exists in various forms, though far less frequently than in the past. But as we reflect on the medieval era, it's important to remember how far we've come and how far we still have to go to build a more just, humane, and compassionate society. As you lie in bed tonight, listening to the sounds of the modern world outside, it's hard to imagine the cruelty and fear that ruled the lives of ordinary people centuries ago. But that fear still echoes today in the ways we punish, control, and discipline. The dark side of justice in the medieval world serves as a warning, reminding us of the dangers of using power without mercy and control without compassion. We may have left behind the stocks and the gallows, but the lessons of that time about fear, control, and punishment still shape the world we live in today. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through the brutal punishments of medieval justice, it's important to pause and reflect on just how far the world has come. The medieval justice system, with its reliance on fear, humiliation, and harsh physical punishment, left a dark legacy. But it also served as a reminder of how easily power can be abused when it's unchecked. These ancient practices, whether it was the horrific public executions, torture for confessions, or the gendered punishments that devastated women, teach us a lot about the capacity for cruelty within systems of authority. When we look back at these medieval punishments, it's easy to feel a sense of relief, knowing that we live in a world that, in many places, has embraced ideas of fairness, rehabilitation, and justice over punishment for punishment's sake. The public spectacle of executions, the endless torture, and the public shaming might seem like things from a distant past, but the scars they left behind are not easily forgotten. These practices continue to resonate in the way we think about crime, punishment, and the role of power in society. The transition from such brutal methods of punishment to more humane approaches has been a long and painful journey, one marked by gradual reform and a growing belief in human rights. While some of the more visible forms of medieval justice, like of public flogging and burning at the stake, are now thankfully relics of the past, we still struggle with how to balance punishment and rehabilitation. In some parts of the world, the death penalty still exists, and in others, prison systems can still mirror the harsh conditions of the medieval dungeons. But we must always strive to remember that justice is not about inflicting suffering, it's about creating a system that serves society and respects the dignity of all individuals. Even as we move forward, it's important to remember the lessons of the past. Just as medieval justice was a reflection of its time, shaped by superstition, fear, and a desire for absolute control, so too can modern justice systems sometimes reflect the values of their society. Our criminal justice systems still operate within a framework of fair punishment. But we have the power and the far moral responsibility to evolve beyond the mistakes of the past. The idea that someone can be far punished not just for their crime, but for their identity, is something we must leave behind. In the modern world, justice should not be about creating fear. It should be about healing, redemption, and ensuring fairness for all. As we close tonight's journey, take a moment to consider just how much we've learned from history. The medieval justice system was undoubtedly brutal, but it also forced us to question the very nature of punishment. It was a world where even the slightest misstep could lead to a life-altering punishment. And yet, over time, we learned that punishment alone does not create a just society. It is mercy, empathy, and fairness that truly define justice, not the cruel tools of the past. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, let the calmness of the modern world wash over you. The shadows of medieval punishment might still linger in the far corners of our history, but we have the power to create a more just, compassionate world for those who come after us. The lessons of the past should not burden us, but inspire us to keep moving forward. Now, dim the lights, let your thoughts settle, and let the quiet of the night remind you of the progress we've made. May tomorrow bring more understanding and kindness than we've ever known before. And remember, just as we've studied the brutal past, we can now work together toward a brighter, more humane future